Morning guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. The Hungarian Grand Prix was a dramatic one last year. Back in 2022, George Russell put his Mercedes on pole position, and it seems he is in pole position to maintain his seat at Mercedes for at least a couple more years. This seems a major departure from Total for Mercedes, with all the flirting with Max Verstappen over the last 12 months, but reports from Sky Sports today suggest Russell will be getting a 2-year extension to be announced very shortly indeed. Where does that leave Max Verstappen, the world champion? Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. Pretty funny picture. I wanted to start here. Istanbul Park. There's been lots of talk about the state of the calendar lately. We know that there's all these theories about going and racing in Bangkok, some sort of Bangkok street race, although Alex Albon will say, no, it's a hybrid track, guys. Don't worry about it. Spa, we know, is moving to a rotational basis on the calendar, and there has been talk from some of the teams that, look, Spa has not produced the greatest racing over the last several years. Do I want Spa to be on the calendar? Absolutely yes, but these modern Formula 1 cars just don't really seem to go hand in hand with Spa. And not just because they don't tend to race very well there, but it's also because of the rain and the safety and other factors, right? Like, again, we flirted this weekend with not even having a race at all. Like, if the rain had continued, would we have had a race? Would it have been 2021 again? But that is a concern for Formula 1 and the teams and the ownership group. So just something to keep in mind, especially with money piling in from all seemingly directions. And Istanbul Park, great track there in Turkey. There has been talk about potentially bringing that back to the calendar as well. But Turkish Motorsport Federation are pretty clear that they don't want a rotational spot. They don't want to be a one-off replacement. They want a long-term contract, and they've been working hard now for some time to try and make that happen. Let's say a few words on Sauber. Bortoleto scored a point back in Spa, which was the first time that Sauber have scored any points in Spa since 2018, I think, with Marcus Ericsson, which is pretty remarkable. But speaking of Sauber, Paul Aron is going to be in their car come Hungary FP1. He's going to be in Hulkenberg Sauber. So it's all kind of confusing what Sauber are doing and also what Alpine are doing, let's be honest, because Paul Aron is one of the Alpine reserve drivers. They've got Jack Doohan, they've got Paul Aron, and he's done a couple of drives. He's an available option, let's say, for the Sauber team if they want to go and get him for FP1 sessions, which is what they are going to do. Does that make him any more likely to get a spot on the grid full time? I'm not so convinced, but who knows what Flavio Briatore is going to cook up next. There was also a big update here, although I read the article, and the article says absolutely nothing more than what is in the tweet. So, as we know, last year, the Christian Horner allegations came through thick and fast. There was an internal investigation done. Horner was cleared of wrongdoing, but we know that the thoughts of the F1 community on this are still rather mixed. The employee who is at the heart of those scandals, really, as in, the female colleague, it seems, of Horner, who, well, there was all sorts of theories anyway, as to what relationships were really at play there behind the scenes. But rumour has it that she has now landed a new role in motorsport. Now, as I say, the article doesn't say anything of what that's about. Whether that's kind of interesting timing, I guess, is one of the questions. Speaking of Red Bull, Dr. Obbs was in the replies here kind of discussing, maybe from a raw Red Bull perspective, but really this affected many teams, whether there should be some sort of rule changes if what we saw in Spa happened again. Because there was a big delay to the Grand Prix, and the teams had elected to change some setups, right? We know that after the sprint, when it was dry on the Saturday, many teams elected to go for more of a wet setup for the race on Sunday, expecting it to actually be wet, which it was. But then the FIA refused to do any racing in the wet until pretty much it started to very much so dry up, and, there was a big debate on that we had a couple of days ago. The point that I wanted to get into really is that this negatively affected the teams that elected to make the changes for wet conditions. I thought it was especially interesting for the drivers starting from the pit lane, because the drivers had chosen, or the teams had chosen, Hamilton, Antonelli, a few of the drivers at the back of the grid, there was 4 of them, that started from the pit lane because they wanted to make major changes to their suspension, to their car, to their setup, and in Hamilton's case, change the whole engine and power unit and all this stuff, and start from the back of the grid. Those guys made a setup choice, generally speaking, to go for more of a rain version of the car. But then, before the race began, they had no option to change that, even though it was pretty clear that, the red flag had flown. The race had technically not begun, right? Because as we know, they didn't start the 3-hour clock, which, whether that should be a rule anyway, that's a debate, but because the race hadn't officially started and the start was aborted, the 3-hour clock hadn't started. So you might argue that the drivers in the pit lane should have had the opportunity to once again change their setup or something to that effect. Now, I think the logistics of this are a bit complicated in the sense that, okay, if you want to change the setup, you've probably got to make a note of it somewhere. And maybe it needs some sort of FIA approval or whatever, but you might have thought that could be the case. And then there's also the argument that, well, maybe if the race is simply delayed, the teams should be able to change their, rear wing levels in case the rain is delayed. But, the issue is, you're not just going to change the rear wing. If you are going to change the rear wing, you're probably going to have to make other setup adjustments too to compensate for that. And, that kind of breaks the whole idea of parc fermé. And then where do you draw the line, right? Like, let's say the race gets delayed for 15, 20 minutes. Are you allowed to do it then? Is there a specific rule that says, okay, if we're expecting the race to get delayed by an hour, you can start making setup changes? It does feel pretty unfair on the teams that went for the rain approach, but I don't really expect to see any changes to this rule because the existence of parc fermé is there for a reason. I'm intrigued to your thoughts on that in the comments section below. This is pretty fascinating. These were the lap times of Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen over the course of the entire Grand Prix. And maybe this shouldn't be massively surprising because Verstappen was probably faster and Leclerc was pushing very hard to keep him behind, and they basically stayed the same distance behind one another the entire race because it was practically impossible to pass, and Leclerc did a good job defending. And they were relatively similar, I would say, in pace. But if you average up all of their lap times that weren't really much different at the best of times, they all averaged to the same number, 1:55.217, or for Max, a 1:55.216. So 1,000th of a second between their two lap times this weekend. It would be fun to see both of these guys in either the same car or a very competitive car at the front of the championship. We got a brief taster of it back in 2022 before it all fell apart. Now, speaking of Ferrari, a few things on Hamilton and what's going on at the Scuderia right now. It was confirmed that the reason why the lift and coast was happening was not necessarily for the same reasons as we have seen before, right? So again, this is another issue when it comes to setup before the Grand Prix, and we'll explain why. But earlier in the season, we know, and it's still going to be the case, that the Ferraris need to do a fair bit of lift and coasting. It seemed to be the case anyway with the older rear suspension setup, that they needed to adjust the brake duct levels to try and make sure that the tyres weren't overheating to such an extent that basically they need to do lift and coast to keep the brakes under control. Now, in Hamilton's case, the reason why he had to do so much lift and coast was actually because he was running out of fuel. And this is very unfortunate because maybe Hamilton could have made much more progress if this wasn't the case, but they'd underfueled him mainly because they expected it to be wet, right? So this is another thing. They fueled the car expecting a certain level of rain, and then the FIA didn't rain in it, or didn't race in the rain, and therefore he had a bigger wing on the back of the car, and which obviously costs more fuel to push yourself through the air. And then because it's not raining, you're actually struggling more to hold on to the fuel because you're spending more time at full throttle, right? So this was Hamilton's major issue, really, that after the first part of the race was over, he pretty much spent the rest of the time lifting, coasting behind the Williams, which was a pretty unfortunate conclusion, but those are just Ferrari things sometimes. Now, the other update to have is that Johanna Hatz, we talked about yesterday, was potentially going to be his performance engineer, but then Autosport removed that article. It seems like Hatz is still going to be working with Charles Leclerc, and actually the man coming in is Luca Diella. So we talked about this yesterday, but he's worked for 5 years at Mercedes high-performance powertrains. He's worked with Hamilton before, and it seems like this is another change that Ferrari are making, and maybe Hamilton's making, to get him more comfortable, but also potentially to just have another Mercedes voice in the room. This man in the background here is Jerome D'Ambrosio. We know that Loic Serra has come over from Mercedes, and it feels like Hamilton's trying to form, I wouldn't say a super team precisely in the same way that we've seen at Ferrari in the past, but it does feel like there are elements of that Mercedes team coming over to Ferrari. Like, it's not Pete Bonnington, and it may not end up happening regardless, but it's just worth thinking about, and he's going to work alongside Riccardo Adami, and that's what's happening there. There was also an announcement that Hamilton gave, so we're expecting in a couple of days there's something happening on the 8th of August. This got quite a lot of traction. People are like, oh, here we go. Some sort of big rumours or whatever are happening, and if you go to his Instagram, you'll see this, and a couple of things, really. He strikes the match for the 8th of August, and then, it's obviously there's something to sell, isn't there, right? You know how it is. It's like that Max Verstappen clip. This smells like an opportunity to sell or whatever. So I don't really know what that is, but I don't think it's anything crazy, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. Now, a couple of things on Ferrari. Now, we know that in Montreal, well, there's now further rumours about this, of the changes that were made to Charles Leclerc's car back in Montreal and the consequences that had. We know that he crashed in free practice. He put it in the wall at turn, 4, the first right-left-hander of the track, and it affected the rest of his weekends there. And obviously he took the blame for that, and understandably so. But then we saw Hamilton use equally the same new brake pads in Spa for the first time. And then we saw what happens at the bus stop chicane. Hamilton was like, damn, that's the first time in my career that I've ever locked up the rear tyres like that and sent the car spinning at the final corner. And for the rest of the weekends, Hamilton was actually very mighty on the brakes. We know what was happening in the Grand Prix on the Sunday. So Hamilton said, this is my first time using this new package over a long distance. And it turns out that, yeah, these were the brake pads. So there was a new brake pad setup that Leclerc began using in Montreal, maybe to try and help the issue with the lift and coast, but it still seems to be relevant. So the article suggested from Auto Racer here that the new brake pads respond very differently compared to the previous version, especially at the beginning of braking when the pedal is first pressed, which does explain what happened to Hamilton at the bus stop that he was so surprised by. The updated specification offers a sharper initial bite, which requires a readjustment of brake balance and a greater shift of braking force towards the front. Again, there is an argument here. Should Ferrari have given this to Hamilton on a sprint weekend? I think that in hindsight may be a mistake, right? Because he's only had one practice session to get to grips with the new brake pads. And in theory, if maybe Hamilton had them first introduced in Hungary, he would have 3 hours of practice with the new brake pads to make sure that he wouldn't make that kind of error in qualifying. But in some sense, I don't think you can blame Hamilton too much, pushing to the limit, only 1 hour under his belt with his new brake pads that are more sensitive to the initial press of the brakes, to then, effectively that seemed to be anyway, what happened at the end of that sprint qualifying lap. And sure, the next day, the pace didn't seem to be that great either, and then he got his lap time deleted for track limits, which was not a mistake of the brake pads, but it's still relevant to think about. And also, as they're suggesting here, you need to change the brake balance, you need to shift the braking force more forward. And that's maybe something they only figured out with Hamilton through the weekends. But anyway, Hamilton tends to use these changes more conservatively compared to Leclerc, which is why the lift and coast, which has been so necessary for Ferrari to keep hold of those brakes on Leclerc's car, hasn't been quite so necessary for Hamilton. So there's swings and roundabouts of Ferrari's season. There was some other talk, though, that it is possible that Ferrari could actually, at some circuits, still compete with the McLarens from now to the end of the year. Piastri stretches out a bit of an advantage. Leclerc and the Ferrari generally looked pretty strong at Spa. I think in Hungary I'm expecting that to continue to some degree. But Mercedes' fall-off has been the key benefit, really, for Ferrari, and the fact that Red Bull are continuing to struggle, despite the fact that their new floor and the changes do seem to be working, because when they threw most of the changes on Tsunoda's car, all of a sudden he got substantially faster. But this is the big update of the day on the future of George Russell. We have talked now for near enough 16 months, probably more, really, about the future of Max Verstappen and Red Bull. What's that going to look like? Is Toto Wolff interested? Are they having conversations out on their yachts in Sardinia? These are things that are possible. It was my opinion for some time that Mercedes would elect to keep the current driver pairing that they have. I felt like from top to bottom, it just seemed like a slightly more sensible decision. Getting Max is very tempting, of course. He is the best driver, but it does carry some level of risk. You have to deal with the Jos Verstappen situation. And there are other factors maybe that, we know what Max has done to his teammates, the implications that's had on the team winning Constructors' Championships long term, things like this that are worthy of consideration if you're Mercedes, in addition to the fact that George Russell's been excellent and Antonelli is clearly very talented, despite recently the car taking a nosedive has affected Antonelli's mistakes and performances. Still, getting rid of Russell, given that over the course of this season so far, he's pretty much been on Verstappen's level, I would say, on average. Verstappen's probably still been better, certainly over the last couple of Grand Prix where Mercedes have struggled. You would say that Verstappen's probably been the driver of the season, unless you want to argue Piastri. But whatever way you want to do it, Russell has been performing at an exemplary level and also just fits Mercedes very well, right? Like, he is the perfect Mercedes man in many respects. He fits the culture of the team. and things are working pretty well from a driver lineup perspective. So you throw Max Verstappen in, okay, yeah, maybe you do extract some more performance, and I'm sure that you probably would, certainly on certain weekends where Max is a driver capable of winning a race like Brazil 2024, and George most likely is not. But nonetheless, there are compelling arguments either way. The point is, if Max was totally free and available, maybe this would be a far more difficult decision. But with Max stuck because of Mercedes' downfall, really, in the position of being third in the championship, he's not going to have his contract clause break at the midsummer break, and that means that it would cost 100 million euros or something to buy Max out of that contract. And if you're considering, well, George and Kimi and all the positives that has versus Max and Kimi, or Max and George, maybe even with all the risks that that could have, but also, of course, the massive upsides, plus 100 million, that then changes the dynamic to some degree. So Sky Sports did an article on this. They describe all of the things that have happened recently, the speculation around Russell's future, the speculation around Verstappen's future, and then Sky Sports says very clearly, Sky Sports News, and this is not Sky Sports Italia, who we know will say things that maybe not be true, I don't know, but Sky Sports News, because the other week there was a rumour that like Sky Sports Italia put something out, and then actual Sky Sports News said, well, we're not so sure about that. They understand that prospective extension would be a multi-year deal, which would tie Russell to the team until at least the end of the 2027 season, which is, yeah, very interesting assessment, really, because this was the big theory, the big rumour around what they would do with Max, especially because Toto has been very clear that his discussions with Max have not just centred on 26, but also about the future beyond that as well. And we believe that the current story goes that Red Bull have told Max, look, please just stay for 1 year. We'll do our best to prove to you that this is the place to be. And if we don't, then you can just leave. No worries if you want to leave for 2027, but just please stay for this year. That seems to be what Max has effectively agreed to. But in light of that, you might think that, well, if Max is potentially going to be available for 27, do you want to give Russell a 2-year deal, or would you prefer to give Russell a 1-year extension, some sort of a 1+1, where you can choose if you want just to drop him for Max if the opportunity arises? Because let's say they start out next season, Mercedes are frying, but Russell's not maybe doing quite as well as he should do, maybe they're losing marginally to McLaren, then Max obviously will see what Mercedes are doing and might say to Toto, hey, you know, this is the time to drop George. But if they're going to give him a 2-year deal, like a 2-year guaranteed deal, maybe a 2+1 or something, then it's a pretty big statement, really, from Toto to say, look, George is our man. They're putting their faith in George and showing him that, yeah, they are going to reward his good performance with a longer-term deal, because no driver wants to be on a 1-year deal, right? And yeah, it puts them under pressure. Maybe for some drivers it makes them perform better, some drivers more than likely the opposite. But the big rumour is that Russell is going to get a deal which locks him down until at least 2027. The rumour is it's going to be like a 30 million euro per year deal. Russell doesn't have that much leverage in these discussions. Obviously, a driver would always want a longer contract and for more money, but it's not like Russell has massive leverage because he clearly wants to drive for Mercedes, so they can pretty much offer him any figure as long as it's reasonably competitive in the market, and he's going to be taking it. It also saves Mercedes a lot of money, this, right? I mean, they have to pay Russell far less than they'd have to pay Max, and also they don't have to pay 100 million euros to buy Max out of his deal. So from a couple of angles, this makes sense, but that is the big rumour, that at the summer break, or maybe around the Hungarian Grand Prix or shortly afterwards, we are going to get some announcement that he will be staying at Mercedes for at least another couple of seasons, which is pretty interesting for his colleague Antonelli, but also for what Max might potentially do. Max might be in the scenario now to think, okay, well, I'm maybe hoping that Mercedes aren't the best team next year, and it's actually somebody like McLaren or somebody like Aston Martin, maybe even Ferrari, where Max could potentially go if he wanted to. And we know that Toto said back in Spa that he's confident that he will be able to sleep well, Russell, over the summer break. So probably that tells us what we need to know, especially now Sky Sports are being pretty clear that he's going to get a 2-year extension. Is this the right call from Mercedes? I think extending Russell is the correct decision. Would I have been very shrewd and given him a 1+1? You know, it wouldn't make Russell very happy, but it would make it very clear what the situation could be to Max as well as Russell. Maybe I would have done. And obviously right now we don't know what the deal actually does look like, but all we know is that Helmut Marko is saying that, yeah, Max is staying for 2026. He is not going anywhere. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Just one final thing, talking of Max. This is pretty crazy. As world champion, Max has never gone 3 consecutive races without being on the podium, but that's what's happened over the last 3 weekends, and that's the longest that's ever been as a run since way back in 2019. So, back in 2019, Kimi Antonelli was probably tiny driving in karts, and that's the last time that Max went 3 consecutive races without actually being on the podium, and it's happened again this season now in 2025. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.